Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Welcome back to Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, FCRIIFF, and today we're going to do the second half of the short story Radicalized from the same titled short story collection by Cory Doctorow. This is going to be a short one, um, and things are going to escalate even further, if you can believe it, from where things wound up. So our plucky protagonist, uh, whose name is eluding me, Joe Gorman, to catch people up to speed. Joe Gorman's wife came down with cancer, a particularly nasty form of cancer, and there's not really any realistic treatment, and the only treatments available are experimental ones, and their insurance will not cover it. So this causes Joe Gorman to go into a bit of a tailspin, um, emotionally and psychologically, until he comes across a forum, the FCRIIFF forum, um, or the Fuck Cancer Right in Its Fucking Face forum. I can say that and mean it. Um, where basically a bunch of people in the exact same situation are. Now, Joe's fortunes change. Um, this for short, the forum is called FCRIIFF or FCRIIFF, if you're being pleasant. Um, so Joe's fortunes change when his wife Lacey has a spontaneous remission, which is not something you can reasonably expect to occur generally. So he, you know, she, and their daughter have gotten very lucky in this regard. However, he keeps on the FCRIIFF forum, um, and the tenor of discourse on this forum changes a bit. It becomes, shall we say, radicalized. He said the thing. Basically, some people decide, you know what? I've got nothing to live for once my kid or significant other dies of cancer, which the insurance companies refuse to pay for or even contribute to the paying for of the treatment. So I'm going to go to an insurance company's headquarters, and I'm going to blow myself up. Is it terrorism? Yes, yes, it is. By just about any reasonable definition of the term. Whether it's being effective is anyone's guess, but it is people finding an outlet and trying to make a statement. And boy, howdy are they. Unfortunately, despite his good fortune, our protagonist, has kept on the forum even while this is happening. He's tried to be a moderating influence, and that really hasn't worked. Um, the practical upshot of this is that he has been in constant contact with some people who have then gone forth and blown themselves up. And he has not called the police or other federal authorities about this. I wonder if there will be consequences for that. As they say, they don't make money from curing cancer, only treating it forever. This is less about the medical industrial complex in terms of solving the cancer problem, rather than it's about the fact that it just doesn't balance out on spreadsheets for insurance companies to pay out. Um, I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm not going to do that right just yet. I have strong opinions, very, very strong opinions. Um, in this case, it's more about how the insurance companies, well, you know, they want to bank on the fact that it's basically a grift. In its way, it's a grift. It's it is essentially a confidence game at its core, although a sanctioned one and also one that can be beneficial to the end user rarely. But the general idea from the insurance company's perspective is never, ever, ever pay out, ever, um, if you can possibly help it. Keep getting money in, don't ever pay out. So if you're put into a situation where you've got someone with cancer and you have to pay out, you're going to find any excuse to avoid doing it because that's a lot of money. Because of the medical industrial complex and how expensive absolutely everything in that field has exploded to become. There's a whole diatribe associated with that that I'm not going to go into because that's all I'll be doing. I'll be ranting and raving, and I don't need to sound like more of an incoherent individual than I already am. Suffice it to say, for the purposes of the characters in this, um, the hammer is about to fall. We can feel the hammer about to fall. Mostly because our protagonist, Joe, has been contacted right before someone went and blew themselves up with an actual phone call. So it's... I wonder if the authorities are going to keep track of that one. So for your second comment, all the weird chemicals in our food, Americans are given cancer on purpose. I do everything in my power to subscribe to the philosophy of Hanlon's razor, which is there. It's like Occam's razor, but instead of there's clearly a cabal or conspiracy afoot, rather than there's clearly a cabal or conspiracy afoot, it's just a bunch of just everybody involved basically just doing self-serving interests, and the end result looks very similar to unmitigated planned evil. There's actually people just being complete self-serving dinguses and stupid. Um, which is maybe giving people too much benefit of the doubt. Um, but I do it to keep from screaming at things. So, because otherwise, I can see myself being in the position of some of these people who went and blew themselves up very easily. It would not be hard. It would not be hard. Now, the thing that keeps me from doing it is mostly just general laziness and a fear of consequences. But once you get over that particular hump, you could become very motivated indeed. And something like this is something people should be motivated to change, by the way. I'm not necessarily advocating these specific methods, um, and as a casual reminder, I put this in the stream description. Maybe I should have done it for the first one. This is a fictional story starring fictional characters. The views and actions contained therein are not necessarily the views and actions of the author or the narrator. The narrator is me, the author is Cory Doctorow. Um, I shouldn't have to say any of that, but we're doing it now anyway. In case I need to cover my ass from being on the watch list, I am certainly on at this point, just for reading this aloud. But I think it's worth listening to anyway, and seeing a possible hypothetical hypothetical scenario in which certain things go down and what results from those certain things. Anyway, with that, I'm going to get cracking. I'll read like the last half page that we left off on last week, and then we'll get cracking. Yes, organic chemistry and personal theology is hard. Yep. Suffice it to say, I don't straight up disagree with you, Kinetic, but I have caveats. I'm not going to say there's a straight up cabal, but at the same time, the end result looks very, very similar. Regrettably. Regrettably. Anyway, we'll get cracking in just a sec. Here is the last paragraph and a half, or half page. Death Eater had wheeled himself into a health insurance conference at a Sheraton, a big trade show that had put on extra security because the people who went were already a little afraid. But Death Eater had booked a room weeks before, and he paid for valet parking and had a bellman help lift him into his chair and hang his pack on the chair back, then wheeled himself in, checked in, and wheeled toward the elevator bank, flashing his room key at the private security guards who were stopping everyone who tried to go past the ballrooms. No one wanted to pat down an old white man with a room key, wearing a gaily colored aloha shirt and a battered straw hat, pale skinny legs sticking out of baggy shorts. He had timed his arrival for 10 minutes before the morning plenary, when all the conference goers were milling around out front of the big ballroom, drinking coffee and eating muffins and chattering. He wheeled himself dead center of the crowd, and the death toll was spectacular. Lacey didn't know what was wrong with Joe, but she knew something was up. "No more of that message board, Joseph," she said sternly. "Too much screen time, Daddy," Maddie said, a perfect imitation of her mother, made all the more uncanny by their increasing resemblance and a recent matching mommy-daughter haircut with blue highlights. He picked up Maddie and gave her a hard squeeze while she squealed and kicked and laughed. "Okay, kiddo," he said, and caught Lacey's eye. Lacey looked worried. Joe had the school run that morning. Lacey had gone back to work, landing a job at a call center that handled reservation problems for a big hotel chain, and Joe had shifted his hours around so that he could do the drop-off in the morning and Lacey could do the pickup at night. It wasn't a good career move. There was a direct correlation between being at your desk at 8 a.m. and getting a promotion. But since the day of Lacey's diagnosis, all his passion for a career had leaked out of him and been replaced by an equally urgent sense that his time with his family was a fleeting thing to be savored. On the drive to school, Maddie wanted to talk about when Mommy got sick, which was a topic that came up a lot. Neither Joe nor Lacey were religious, but inevitably, Maddie had a friend at school who wanted her to know that God had saved her mommy, and that she should be giving thanks to God. She kept bringing this up and was obviously, visibly anxious that they weren't doing enough on that score, and maybe God would change his mind. "So, you know that I don't believe in God, right, kiddo?" He snuck a glance away from the slow-moving traffic and looked at her. She was nodding solemnly. "I think that Mommy just got really, really super lucky, like rolling two sixes in Monopoly 10 times in a row. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be grateful and thankful that we get to have her with us. I wake up every day and I'm thankful. Aren't you?" "Yeah." Her voice was tiny. "Yeah. So if there is a God, then she or he was a phrase Lacey insisted on when they talked about God with Maddie, knows how you feel." He heard her crying in the back seat and pulled the car over. "What is it, baby? Why are you crying?" She snuffled, and he gave her a tissue. "Sometimes I'm not grateful. Sometimes I get mad at her because she won't let me wear what I want or she says I didn't brush my teeth right. What if God sees that I'm not grateful and takes her away?" For the 10 millionth time, Joe cursed the little evangelical kid in Maddie's class who'd put all this crapola inside her innocent, traumatized head. "Well, kiddo, I'm the wrong guy to answer that one because you know I don't believe there is a God. But I don't expect you not to get upset with Mommy. I get upset with her sometimes, too. That happens even when people love each other, especially when people love each other. It's hard work loving someone. All that matters is that you talk about things when you're upset and work them out. You know that even when we get really angry with each other, it always works out and we always end up loving each other again, right? So, what we need to do is just concentrate on getting past the mad part and getting back to the happy part. I'm sure if there is a God, that's all she or he expects from you." Maddie seemed satisfied with that answer, so Joe put the car back into gear and pulled out into traffic. By the time they reached the next set of lights, she was singing the chorus to Yellow Submarine over and over and over again, which was always a good sign. He dropped her off in front of the school, and she blew him a kiss and then came back for her forgotten lunch and blew him another one. Joe drove to work. He tried to focus on thoughts of his daughter and what he could say to her the next time she had questions like this. He tried not to think of the FBI pulling Death Eater's phone records and conducting forensics on his computer. He tried not to think of fathers in Clearwater, Florida, who'd be explaining to their kids for years to come why a strange, angry old white man in a wheelchair murdered their mother. He failed. Are you going to tell me what's wrong, Joseph, or am I going to have to drag you to couples therapy? The week since Death Eater's attack had gone from bad to worse. Every ringing phone, every strange face made him jump and sweat and think about some DHS type, a federal marshal or an FBI agent. He did not log in to FCRIIFF, which was hard because it was his customary 2 a.m. no-sleep therapy, and he was having a lot of 2 a.m. no-sleep nights. Lacey asked him several times what was going on, and he made vague noises about work stress, which was laughable given how little he cared about work. Finally, it had come to this. They were in bed, Matty was down for the night, and he was lying on his side, trying not to grind his teeth, his mind circling around and around from Death Eater to the FBI to the dead people of Clearwater, and now Lacey. He rolled over. I'm sorry, Lace. It's just some shit in my life that I'm not able to shake off and that I don't want to dwell on. The last thing I want to do is go over it with you. And make you an accessory to a crime. I just want to put it out of my mind. She gave him a look of pure skepticism. You're doing a really shitty job of it, if you don't mind my saying so. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. I love you very much, my husband, but if you can't figure out how to deal with this on your own, and you won't let me help you, and you won't get help from anyone else, then you and I are going to have a serious fucking problem. Lacey didn't swear often. I hear you, he said. Give me 48 hours? I probably just need to download that meditation app or go for a run or something. 48 hours, and then you either spill everything to me or I frog march you to a shrink. Joe put on his bravest face. Deal. Meditation proved impossible. There was no way he could get his thoughts away from the Death Eater video, the words they'd exchanged, the thought of all those families torn apart. But he did go for a run, strapping his phone to his bicep and putting in his earbuds. It was late fall and hot, but not blazing hot, and he lost himself in the rhythm of his footfalls and the Creedence Clearwater Revival in his earbuds. The effect of losing himself was near miraculous. Weight lifted from his chest and shoulders. Sounds were sharper, smells better. He picked up the pace. Inevitably, he overdid it. Too much running after too long a hiatus. He stumbled and nearly went down, and when he straightened up, his head was whirling, and he nearly lost his balance again. He was in a cute pedestrianized shopping area, and he found a bench and sat down on it, his legs trembling and his balance whirling. He put his head in his hands until the whirling stopped, then sat back, sweat coursing down his face and back. His playlist ended, and he got his phone out and started prodding for another round of music for a slower jog home, and autopiloted his way to the headlines. A shooter had targeted Senator Graham, Joe's own senator, on the steps of the Capitol. Graham had won an insurgent seat with promises to consider all options and fix the mess in health care, and had joined the obstructionist bloc in the Senate, voting the straight ticket with the party leadership as they blocked every proposal, no matter how modest. After his first year in office, he'd canceled all town halls, and Politico had done some data journalism showing that he was the hardest senator for a constituent to sit down with, either at home or in D.C. The shooter had winged two D.C. cops and a federal marshal, injured 9 bystanders, got a center mass shot in on the senator's chief of staff, and took a piece out of the senator's earlobe with a modified full-auto AR-15. That was all in 18 seconds, which is how long it took for the horde of cops present from 6 agencies to shoot him 47 times. The senator was initially reported to be badly injured, but it turned out that he was merely covered in gallons of other people's blood and in hysterics. The shooter had uploaded a suicide video to YouTube before leaving his hotel room in Adams Morgan, and though Google had taken it down within minutes of it hitting Twitter and Facebook, it had already been mirrored to a bunch of overseas servers on smaller platforms, and was getting a lot of play on the #you should be afraid hashtag, which had started with the second bombing. Joe read and read, and his trembling wasn't going away. Did this shooter have a FCRIIFF account? Did he live near Joe? When would the feds show up at his door? The senator's bloody, terrified face was perfect viral content, and it raced around the net even faster than the suicide video. The sweat he'd worked up running had turned icy. The talking heads had spent weeks wondering where the president was amid all these killings. Apart from a few tepid statements of sympathy for the families of the victims, he'd been playing it very low key. His proxies had praised him for his restraint and his canny refusal to glorify the sad, sick people who had committed these atrocities, lest he inspire more people to follow in their footsteps. But with a shooting on his doorstep, the president could no longer afford silence. He'd been en route home from his Cape Town summit on Air Force One when the news broke, and after huddling with his communications team, he'd sat down with the press corps and delivered an unhinged, rambling statement that ranged over America's best health care in the world, the evils of something-for-nothing culture, and the ongoing project to clean up the Obamacare disaster before getting on the main attraction, calling the shooter a terrorist. The word rang in Joe's ears. His earbuds felt sweaty and itchy. He'd been a teenager on 9/11, and his strongest memory from then was this new word, terrorist, and its weird resonances, like it described an orc, ravening and remorseless, superhuman and subhuman all at once. It was a word to shrivel the balls. He'd heard white people called terrorists before, but only weirdo kids from Berkeley who ran away from home to join jihadi guerrillas in the Middle East. This was the dropped shoe he'd been waiting for, a moment he could never come back from. He knew that once terrorist stuck to you, you couldn't unstick it. It spread from the person it landed on to the people around them. It even traveled back in time and stuck to people the terrorist used to know. For example, if you happened to spend a lot of time in a message board where terrorism was planned, then you were very likely a terrorist too. And if that message board was on the dark web, forget it. His jog home was curiously lighthearted. He'd been cringing, waiting for this to happen. Now it had happened. The bell had rung, and he couldn't unring it. Nothing he did on FCRIIFF, no amount of patient arguing or conspicuous calls for reason would change it. He was, in some weird sense, free. What's more, it might be his last freedom, because now there would certainly be feds. Lacey was doing yoga in front of the TV when he got home. She asked him skeptically if he was okay, and he must have been convincing because she sentenced him to a shower and announced that they'd be going to the farmer's market for Saturday brunch. It was a sweet Saturday. Even Mattie, who hated the market, had a good time, thanks to Joe's relaxation of family policy on cakes and cookies. He took enormous pleasure watching her stuff her face on baked goodies and then sprang for a face painting. Lacey grumbled a little about the indulgences, but she was clearly very happy to see the old Joe coming back. When Joe woke up again at 2 a.m. to pee, he autopiloted to the spare room and fired up Tor browser, heading straight for FCRIIFF. All his anxiety about logging in was gone. Here, on the other side of the point of no return, there was no reason not to visit his old friends. Things were what they were, and nothing he did from now on would make them worse or better. But FCRIIFF was gone. Both the light and dark versions were 404, page not found. And that set him off again. Because, he realized, the FCRIIFFers were his people. They were his community. Some of them scared the shit out of him, and some of them made him want to punch a wall, but it was his place in the digital world, a place where a truth he'd come to feel deep in his bones was universally acknowledged. Most Americans knew that the healthcare system was fucked up, and they even knew that health industry execs and the politicians they purchased on the cheap were behind it. But the FCRIIFFers alone understood how central those two facts were, and how evil they were. Joe didn't want to kill anyone, but deep inside, he knew that there were plenty of people who warranted killing. There were 2 bombings and another shooting the next week. Nice middle-class white dudes who'd watched their wives and kids die, or who were living under death sentences themselves. The news was full of stories about the checkpoints being set up outside hospitals and insurance company buildings and politicians' offices, and then 3 guys in 3 cities with no obvious connection to one another went and blew themselves up at 3 of those checkpoints, blowing up the huge crowds of nice people with good jobs who'd been waiting to clear the scanners so they could earn a living for their families. The bombs went off within minutes of each other and killed more people than all the other attacks combined. It was clear that there were other FCRIIFFs out there. They were in the press, too, and then the president mentioned them. The dark caves where the good people are made evil. And still the feds did not come for Joe. It occurred to him that they might have more leads for this epidemic of nice, respectable white dudes blowing shit up than they could follow up, and they might be a long time indeed in coming for him. "Why are those men killing those people?" Mattie asked over breakfast. Another classmate had been telling her that she shouldn't go to the doctor because crazy men were killing anyone near a hospital. "They're crazy," Lacey said, shoving a bowl of berries and yogurt under her nose. "Sick in the head." "But why?" "Because some people just go crazy, honey." "But why?" "Joe?" Lacey threw a dishwasher tablet into the machine and headed to the bathroom, scooping up the laundry as she went. "Daddy?" "How come I get the hard ones?" "Because you're so good at them," Lacey called down from the bathroom. Joe smiled and that made Mattie smile, but she hadn't forgotten. "How come, Daddy?" "Because," he said and shook his head, "there are some bad men who decided that they could be rich if they made it, so okay, that's a weird line break. Sorry. Because there are some very bad men who decided that they could be rich if they made it so going to the doctor was very expensive. They made it so expensive that people are dying because they can't afford it. That's what nearly happened to Mommy." Madison's face clouded over, the way it always did when this subject came up. "So there are other men who've had to see their babies and their wives and their friends die, and it makes them go crazy. So they go and kill people who work for the bad guys who made the doctor so expensive." Mattie looked frustrated. "But why?" He broke it down into smaller pieces, hearing himself use terms like bad guys and good guys, and thinking about how Lacey would not approve of this framing, but that the fuckriffers surely would.
I don't think killing people is good.
It's not, sweetie.
You said that the bad guys killed people by not letting them see the doctor, though.
Yes, that's right.
So they're killing people.
Yes.
So they're the same as the people who are shooting people.
Not really. It was time to get dressed and get into the car. Maddie wouldn't let him put music on during the drive. She wanted to shout more morally fraught questions from the back seat. This was a teachable moment, Joe knew, and his responsibility as an adult was to follow Maddie where she wanted to lead.
Why do the bad guys want to kill people?
They don't want to. He stopped himself. Keep it simple, stupid. Because they get rich and they can buy nice houses and cars and vacations if doctors are expensive.
Why do the guys with the bombs want to kill people?
Because they're angry at the bad guys. A long pause from the back seat. He swung into the school drop-off horseshoe. All right, kiddo, we'll pick this up tonight after school. Standing on the sidewalk with her lunch and her school bag, she tapped on the passenger window and he rolled it down.
I think that the bad guys are worse than the guys with the bombs. The guys with the bombs are just punishing the bad guys for killing their kids.
And a future fuckriffer is born. Joe tried to imagine the conversations that Maddie's friends would have with their parents that night, after Maddie got through with them. The FBI staged coordinated raids on 4 private homes and 2 data centers, claiming that they had seized 3 different message boards where the deranged killers had planned their attacks, and arrested the owners of those boards. Joe watched the perp walks on social media, 4 white guys in middle age in their pajamas, cuffed hands behind their backs, terrified looks, and curious neighbors. The cops had served no-knock warrants on all 4, gone in with guns drawn and SWAT backup, but had somehow managed to fail to shoot any of them in the process. Joe took some comfort in that. Social media exploded with the personal lives of these 4 guys, who were, to put it mildly, basic as fuck. They had bullshit jobs. Jobs that no one, not even them, thought worth doing. One was a management consultant. One was a customer service manager for a call center. One was an ad tech programmer. One was a marketing specialist for cryptocurrency startups. All shared one trait. They'd watched the slow death of an insured loved one who'd been denied coverage. In an earlier age, they'd have stewed in private misery, become alcoholics, shot themselves. Instead, they'd followed simple online instructions for starting a message board and hosting it on a bulletproof server accessible only via the Tor network. They hadn't detonated bombs or gone on a shooting spree. They hadn't even egged on the people who had. But they'd provided a place for it all to happen, had watched it all happen, and hadn't shut it down. That was enough. One of them, the management consultant, was a Canadian expat, and his Twitter was full of comparisons between US healthcare and the Canadian system, and that kicked off a whole other social media storm about Canada and what America could learn from it, and also whether Canadians were secretly terrorists, which was jokey, but not entirely. The South Park memes were epic, and late-night comedy had a ball with it. The Canadian Prime Minister weighed in on the subject and said that even though she was a conservative, she understood that there were some places where markets couldn't do the job, and healthcare was one of them. It won her a lot of points with her base, and it also played really well with the undecided Canadian voters who generally held the Tories in bad odor, but who were swayed enough by this demonstration of compassionate conservatism that they elected Quebec's first ever conservative provincial government later that month. If there was one thing that would motivate Canadians, it was the sense that American politics were so screwed up that they made Canada shine by comparison. None of the 4 got bail. Maddie had a cold, and it took forever to get her to cough herself to sleep. Joe found Lacey sitting up in bed with her bedside light on, reading her phone.
You remember that message board you used when I was sick?
He tried to he tried to stay casual as he hung up his robe and slid into bed next to her. Yeah.
It was one of these, right?
She showed him her phone. There'd been a failed bombing, a guy who'd been shot as he approached the armed checkpoint at the end of a Kaiser hospital driveway. He'd blown himself up, and the shrapnel had injured some other people, but none seriously, and at least they'd been close to a hospital. Kaiser had even waived their co-pays. Not exactly, he lied.
How do you mean, not exactly, exactly?
She sounded pre-pissed, like she wasn't in a mood to be screwed around with.
Lace, don't, Joe. Just tell me. Those guys who you spent all those hours talking to, are they the ones running around committing mass murder?
Honestly, she just stared. I don't know, which was a lie. I mean, they could be. They were pissed enough about it. And I don't know any of their real names. Everyone used a screen name. I stopped logging in, and then it shut down anyway.
How'd you know it shut down if you weren't logging in anymore?
Shit. After some of the killings, I decided to have a look. I was curious too, but it was gone.
Do you think it was one of the ones the FBI shut down?
Nah, it was before that.
Good, because if it was, that would mean that there was a server in an FBI evidence locker with details that pointed back to our home and our family.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about too. When Lacey finally fell asleep, Joe slipped out of the bedroom and looked up the Arizona ACLU phone number and did his best to memorize it. Just in case. The FBI arrested 42 people the following week, acting on leads from the seized servers. Every one of them was planning to act on mass murder. Oh, sorry. Every one of them was planning an act of mass murder, supposedly. Joe tried not to watch the news reports of the arrests, clicked away from social media doxings of the guys in custody. He caught Lacey staring worriedly at her phone more and more. A bipartisan group of senators introduced a Medicare for All bill with a lot of fanfare, and half of America cheered them on, while the other half followed Fox News in condemning them as appeasers who had caved in to terrorism.
Never change, America. Please change. For the better? Please?
The next day, a guy took a shot at the senator from the great state of Maine. He was killed by the Secret Service and immediately doxed online. The guy had run for Congress 11 times as the only Republican seeking the nomination in a hardcore Democratic machine seat in suburban Chicago. Each of his campaigns had featured rants about the cartels of Jewish bankers and George Soros. In between the Blues Brothers I hate Illinois Nazis memes, there were posts from people who said that this was inevitable and would only get worse and blamed healthcare extremists for starting it. Joe stopped sleeping at night. He'd lie in bed, earbuds in, listening to old comedy podcasts, until Lacey dropped off. Then he'd go into the basement and jog on the treadmill and lift his old weights, trying to obliterate the whirl of thoughts going around and around his brain. He drank coffee all day at his desk until his guts burned, and nearly killed himself falling asleep at the wheel one night. I don't know why I'm having difficulty with emphasis on the right syllable today. Lacey made a doctor's appointment for him and told him he was calling in sick to work the next day, and wouldn't hear any argument. The doc listened attentively, if impersonally, and then shook his head. Sounds like you're having a hard time, Joe. Joe felt tears well up. Yeah, he said, barely a whisper. How's everyone in your family? The doctor looked at his screen. How's Lacey?
Joe had talked extensively with the doc about Lacey's health, back when everything had been so scary. He remembered the doc commiserating about the bastards at the insurance company who'd turned down her therapy. From the doc's expression, startlement, mistrust, he'd just remembered it too. Lacey's great. He felt the tears slipping down his cheeks, but he didn't know what they were for. Full recovery. Her hair's down to here now. He touched his shoulders. The doc handed him a Kleenex box. That's great news, really great. He shifted in his chair. A miracle, really? Joe was really crying now. Joe tapped at his computer for a while. Look, I wanted to refer you for psychiatric care, but it looks like you only get 25% coverage. There's a woman I really like. She used to be an ER doc and then became a psychiatrist. You'll really like her, I think. She's not afraid to prescribe mood stabilizers, but they're not her first choice either. But she's not cheap. I know this is a hard question, but do you think you can afford it? Joe started to laugh, still crying, then sobbing. The doc looked uncomfortable, then alarmed. Joe didn't know exactly how much time they had for the appointment, but he was pretty sure he'd run over, and there would be other patients waiting. He pulled himself together, blew his nose, and wiped his eyes. I'm sorry, he said. It's just... He waved his hands and dropped some snotty Kleenexes. He picked them up. My insurance won't pay for me to go to a shrink to talk about how screwed up my insurance is. Yeah, the doc said. Look, we doctors hate this even more than you do. You only have to deal with them when you're sick. We have to deal with them every damn day. I have 2 admin people out there whose only job is chasing payment from them. I'd heard about that. You haven't heard half of it, believe me. The doc pushed the cart with the computer away, started to rub his eyes, then took his hands away from his face and reached for a pump of hand sanitizer from the wall-mounted receptacle. He looked at Joe. You've been through a lot, Joe. Nearly you losing your wife. It's hard stuff. It's a miracle that she survived, but it also means that you didn't get any counseling or care, the kind of thing that would have kicked in automatically if she hadn't made it. So you're just hanging out there. I had a insurance rep on the phone yesterday telling me that I could refer for unlimited psych care for anyone who's lost someone. They've figured out that the cheapest way to keep from having their heads blown off is to remove barriers to psych treatment. He smiled mirthlessly. Now, I'm not a psychiatric professional, Joe, but I've seen enough PTSD cases to know one when I see one. You need treatment, for the sake of your family and for your own sake. I know you want to be the dad your daughter needs. There's a reason there's so much medical debt in this country. Your health is just that important. More important than your credit card balance or your credit rating or even your mortgage. If I write you a referral to Dr. Hadid, will you find a way to see her? You could try discussing all cash payments. A lot of doctors offer discounts for cash up front. Joe blew his nose. Yeah, he said. Thanks. Dr. Hadid's cash rate was $125 an hour, plus $75 for the initial consultation. $200 later, Joe knew that he'd never be going back to her. He'd frozen in the office, unable to talk, terrified of what might come out. Terrified he might start spouting off like a fuckriffer of the worst kind, inspire her to call the cops. Instead, he stopped at a CVS and bought 4 different kinds of over-the-counter sleeping pills, and drew up a chart on some scrap printer paper from the guest room and kept track, looking for a pill that gave him the most sleep with the least hangover. What he really wanted was some Ambien, which he'd tried a couple of times in college when he was too wound up to sleep and a buddy had helped him out. There were a lot of places to get Ambien cheap and prescription-free, using dark web markets. He even had some cryptocurrency he'd speculated on when it seemed like it wouldn't ever stop rising. Might as well spend it now before it was completely worthless. But of course, he couldn't remember the obscure .onion addresses for the marketplaces, and the only one he knew by heart was FCRIIFF's, and before he could stop himself or even remember that the site had gone down, he was logging in. The login banner informed him that the site was back up, with all the accounts intact, but all the archives securely deleted. It asked him to delete any screen grabs or saved messages he might have stashed away himself, and welcomed him back on behalf of the new manager, someone called Deadzone 874755, who he couldn't ever recall working with. For the first time in more than a month, he felt relaxed. All the tension drained out of him as he skimmed the boards, laughing at the bullshit sessions and bon mots, reading updates from old friends. Like it or not, these were his people. This was his place, his spiritual home. And if there were fringe elements in his community who did bad things, unconscionable things, well, what of it? No one faulted soldiers for staying in the army just because someone wearing the same uniform shot up a village or waterboarded a prisoner. The camaraderie and understanding he got from the FCRIIFFers, the bond of shared experience, it was irreplaceable. He had a right to that, and no one had the right to make him stop. He never egged anyone on to an act of violence. In fact, he'd done everything he could to stop the violence. Not to mention, the cause was just. The most just one. Letting people die because saving their lives would erode profits was a wicked act, and people who endorsed that act were wicked people. Blowing them up or shooting them wasn't right, but a world in which the wicked went about their days frightened of retribution was a more just one than a world where the wicked held their heads high. The Department of Justice sent sternly worded memos to 5 large internet companies asking them to seriously contemplate suppressing the #you should be afraid hashtag. They stopped short of demanding this. Later that day, someone dumped a set of leaked emails between the general counsels of the internet companies and a senior DOJ lawyer who had made this request in private and got told to go pound sand. The consensus was that the DOJ didn't think they could make a court order stick, but having failed to secure quiet, voluntary cooperation, they were trying to get the public on side, getting people to blame the platforms for abetting the killings. It worked, sort of. Joe's friends were evenly split between people who thought that banning the tag was ridiculous and people who thought that the internet companies were total assholes for not falling into line. People used that tag to talk about the issue and the tactics, to share safety tips and discuss motivations. On the other hand, people used the tag to glorify and publicize mass killings. On the other hand, making a new tag wasn't exactly rocket surgery. #afraid should be yes, #YSHLDBFRD. Of course, the FCRIIFFers didn't care. They got all the #you should be afraid talk they needed on their private boards. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minneapolis broke ground on a new building in an industrial park at the end of its own gated cul-de-sac, with high guard towers, automated license plate recognition systems in a 1-mile radius, panic rooms on every floor, and a large staff of 24/7 armed guards. Their shareholder disclosures costed this out and amortized the capital over 5 years, explaining how the running costs would be covered by a combination of a security surcharge on all premiums and a tiny per-share dividend hit. After a short bobble, when the shorts moved into the market, the share price closed up and some shorts took a big hit. They want to prove they're not afraid. Damn Fool was the newest FCRIIFFer. FCRIIFF was a lot harder to find than it used to be, and the new recruits were brought in by old hands, vouched for. His son, Tommy, was 14 years old, track star, accelerated math, Eagle Scout. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Tommy's cancer had not responded to 2 rounds of chemo. He was strong and young and vital, and the same youth that gave him the strength to withstand all that terrible medicine also caused his cells to divide with terrible, regular rapidity, even the cancerous ones. His doc thought that Tommy was a good candidate for chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy, a therapy that was experimental by anyone's lights. But if anyone could survive it, it was Tommy. People who survived that therapy had a good chance of making it 3 years cancer-free, and then the sky was the limit. Tommy was up for it. He even wanted to freeze some sperm in case he decided to have kids later in life. That was the kind of life choice that people who were planning on surviving made. The insurer, Cigna, had other ideas. The bottom line: they would not spend $750,000, table stakes, the total could be much higher, to kill Tommy with an experimental therapy. Not even if Tommy was a fighter and an optimist and young and healthy, except for dying of cancer, and wanted to freeze his sperm. Damfool's wife was inconsolable. His older son, Rhett, had died of an opioid overdose in his senior year, 5 years ago, and the two of them had put everything they had into Tommy, throwing themselves into his life and upbringing with a vigor that Tommy seemed to embrace. They'd all been hurt by what happened to Rhett. For his part, Damfool was barely holding it together. He spent as much time away from Tommy as he could bear to, not wanting to overshadow the boy, and when he wasn't with Tommy, he was trying to console his wife, who was in no mood for consolation, or trying not to drink all the beer in the fridge. Tommy was in a lot of pain, partly because he resisted the painkillers because they were the same ones that Rhett had been addicted to. It was a bad situation. The great old ones of FCRIIFF were grooming Damfool. There were these hit lists that people had made, doxing healthcare execs, analysts, investors, lobbyists, as well as lawmakers at the state and national level who'd carried their water. The dumps had home addresses, known travel routes, even architectural drawings from public records departments showing the floor plans of their homes and offices. These lists weren't hard to come by. They were circulated with glee under the #you should be afraid hashtag. The first time Joe saw one of these files, he thought of how chilling it must be to see your home, your family, your picture, your license plate on a list like this. It gave him a lot of satisfaction that he tried not to think about it too much. It gave him a lot of satisfaction that he tried not to think about too much. Damfool lived in Montana, and, for such a sparsely populated state, Montana sure had a hell of a lot of high-value targets. Small populations had big old boy networks, and they made it easy for corruption to spread, favor to favor, friend to friend. You could see the diffusion pattern in the hit list, which was extensive. The great old ones were good at this pitch. They were just hinting now, not giving Damfool the hard sell. That would come after Tommy's demise. Right now, they were just getting him in position. Joe had seen the playbook before. It was his cue to dive in with a highly symbolic and largely ornamental bid to save his soul. Joe just couldn't. He'd been reading these op-eds by Black Lives Matter activists about the official neglect that people with sickle cell anemia endured, stories about agonized teenagers being tied to hospital beds and told to stop shouting if they wanted to get untied. The general tenor was that the whites who'd suddenly decided that the healthcare system was too sick to live were late to the party. And by the way, let me tell you a little story about the Tuskegee Airmen. Joe found himself imagining what his life would have been like if Lacey had died. If he'd been alone with Maddie, a huge hole in both their hearts. He imagined what life must be like for a parent going through that themselves, watching their kids go through it, watching their nieces and nephews and their friends go through it. He couldn't imagine it. Couldn't imagine tolerating it. How could they tolerate it? He wasn't stupid. He'd heard of white privilege. It was a thing. He got it. The more he thought about this, though, what if Lacey died? What about all those people who've tolerated that and worse? What about everything he could get away with? What What about everything he could get away with that all those other people couldn't? Let's try that sentence from the top. There's something about that that really doesn't read intelligently, and I think it's the way I read it. The more he thought about this, though, what if Lacey died? What about all those people who've tolerated that and worse? What about everything he could get away with that all those people couldn't? When you thought about it that way, he practically had a duty to kill a healthcare executive or two. Tommy died on July 17th. Maddie was in Wisconsin with Lacey, visiting Lacey's cousins, whom she had started talking to again after she came back from the cancer, making a conscious choice to put the old rifts with her family behind her. Without family to give him focus, Joe found himself actually paying attention at work again, answering emails until late at night, then smoothly transitioning into a long session with FCRIIFF. Even though Lacey wasn't around, he still took his laptop into the guest room when it was time to FCRIIFF. Time for FCRIIFF, sorry. Damn Fool was incoherent with grief at first, then coldly violent, writing the most detailed fantasies of murder and mayhem. Then he disappeared. Joe had not engaged with him at all, letting the old ones egg Damn Fool on while Joe watched from the sidelines. But once he went quiet, Joe had a crisis of conscience and sent him a string of private messages begging him to call before he did anything stupid. Damn Fool didn't answer Joe's messages, but the next morning he was walking fuzzy-headed to the toilet in a pair of boxers, holding his phone and thinking about his first cup of coffee, when he saw something outside of the window. He stopped and peered at the shape, trying to make sense of what appeared to be a futuristic robot, at least in the brief instant it took him to realize that it was a man in SWAT armor with a visor and a very large gun, which he was swinging around to point at Joe. Joe opened his mouth to say something. No, or maybe, what the fuck? When he discovered that he was lying on the floor and he couldn't breathe. He tried to get up because something was on his chest and he had to get out from under it, but it wasn't just his lungs that weren't working. He couldn't make his arms or legs move either. It was very noisy all of a sudden, too, and eventually, as he was surrounded by more robot men in body armor with very, very large guns, he realized that he had been shot in the chest. The officer who shot Joe was a SWAT veteran with 22 years on the Tempe PD, during which time he had shot a total of 19 suspects, but Joe was the first white person Officer Connor had shot. Joe was also the first one who survived, and there were social media pundits who hypothesized that Connor's latent white supremacy, the same force that had animated his trigger finger all those times before, had spoiled his aim, sparing Joe's life. He had been hit center mass, but had only suffered a collapsed lung and no damage to his heart. The officer said he'd mistaken Joe's phone for a gun. Joe learned this last detail from the FBI agent who questioned him once he was clear of the anesthesia, handcuffed to his recovery bed and coming to his senses. He learned about the other 18 shootings later. The FBI agent had read Joe's entire series of messages with Damn Fool and wanted Joe to know that in his, Agent Siebold's opinion, Joe had tried to do the right thing. Agent Siebold could tell that he and Joe were on the same team, both of them trying to help these poor, confused, heartbroken men channel their grief into a less pathological course of action. Which was why Agent Siebold had come up with the singularly great idea of helping Joe escape any potential criminal liability in exchange for Joe's cooperation in infiltrating FCRIIFF and catching the Great Old Ones. Agent Siebold strongly implied that there were other collaborators already working with him on FCRIIFF, but that the Great Old Ones' wiliness had foiled their efforts. By working with the Bureau, Joe wouldn't be pioneering the idea of undercovers on the system, but he Joe wouldn't be pioneering the idea of undercovers on the system, but he would be using his unique skills and long-standing access to further his joint mission with the Bureau to save these poor, impressionable men, to say nothing of their victims. Joe was very groggy. The anesthetic was still in his blood, and then there was the fantastic calamity of sensations from his chest cavity, bones, and swollen, stitched skin. A muffled voice in the back of his mind was chattering intensely at him, telling him he needed to talk to Lacey ASAP because she'd be out of her mind, telling him he should not talk to this cop without a lawyer present. Joe listened to the cop talking. Agent Seabold was good, calm, reassuring, friendly. He only wanted the same things Joe wanted. He wanted to help Joe. He knew Joe wanted to help too. Joe tried to speak, but couldn't. His mouth was gummed shut with thick, dried saliva. His tongue was as thick as his fist. Agent Seabold clearly knew his business. Gently, he dipped a large cotton swab in water and swabbed at Joe's lips, then the front of his teeth. A trickle of the flat, room-temperature water moistened Joe's tongue. It felt incredible. "Lawyer," Joe said. The agent looked angry for a second, then he mastered himself and switched to disappointed. "Sorry," Joe added. Then, "Lawyer." It was all he managed before his tongue dried out again. The FBI agent left. It was 10 days before Joe saw a lawyer. In the interim, he was kept in restraints except during doctor visits and physio. These were under guard, stone-faced Phoenix PD cops, and each time one of these officers entered his room, he asked to see a lawyer. It got to be kind of a game. Not a good game. He didn't see Lacey. When he asked the cops, the doctors, the nurses, the PT, about her, they acted like they hadn't heard him. He was pretty sure he could see Lacey whenever he wanted, provided he asked to speak to Agent Seabold first. He almost broke down every day, but he didn't. You know what kept him going? The visit from the guy from hospital billing. His insurance wasn't covering his stay. This was an exemption in his policy for acts of terrorism, and they were invoking it. The hospital's accounting department wanted to know about his assets. They were the only ones who would talk to him about Lacey, and what they wanted to know was whether she had separate finances from his. The billing guy seemed like a decent fellow stuck with a shitty job. Joe knew, somehow, that he made less money than Joe. It was the cheap shoes and the $7 haircut. He was embarrassed and apologetic, but he had a job to do. It wasn't his fault the system was so totally fucked up. There was nothing that one guy could do about it. When the billing guy visited for the third time, Joe decided that he'd go to jail for 100 years before he betrayed FCRIIFF and all who sailed in her. It's so fucking good. It's so good. I'm sorry. It's like, nah. They they only give a shit about the money. They don't give a fuck. Agent Seabold visited just ahead of the lawyer, looking pissed and harried. The last time he'd gently persuaded, but this time he'd wheedled, and it tipped Joe off that things weren't going the way he'd hoped. The lawyer was an old Chinese-American guy who'd been doing pro bono work with the Arizona ACLU since his college days. He showed up an hour after Agent Seabold left the bedside and introduced himself. "Your wife is fine. She wanted me to make sure that you got here. She wanted me to make sure you got that first. She was very adamant. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. She did a lot of legwork, convinced the ACLU that this was something we should be paying attention to. There were a hell of a lot of potential clients who fit your profile, and we've had to prioritize the cases that could make good law or prevent bad law from being made. You're in the latter case. No one alleges that you abetted anyone. Even the FBI says you did what you could to stop things. But you knew about serious crimes that were going to happen, and you didn't go to the cops. They say that makes you an accessory to terrorism. There's an Arizona congressman who called you an enemy combatant. Joe suppressed a groan. Leonard, his lawyer, patted his hand, frowned at the restraints. Look, there's a long process ahead of us. I want to start with some basics. Get you out of these cuffs, get your family in to see you, get you released on bail. Then we can talk about how we're going to keep you out of prison. At least you didn't mention the death penalty. Joe was joking. Leonard didn't smile. Was saving that for when you got your strength back, Leonard said. It's not something I'm unduly concerned with, but whenever there's even a small chance that a court will order an execution, it's something we have to factor into our planning. He gave Joe a moment to soak that in. Now, I want to know everything. He got out a yellow pad. Start at the beginning. The last verified "you should be afraid" killing took place a year and a half later, while Joe was in solitary in the Tucson Supermax pen, having been transferred after he caught a beating at the Maricopa County pen while waiting for a hearing on Leonard's appeal on his bail. The Tucson warden took one look at Joe's beat-up face and taped ribs and ordered him into protective solitary. It had been a week. The killer had been a Jacksonville, Missouri fireman whose Blue Cross Blue Shield refused to cover treatment for dialysis after an acute kidney injury he experienced on the job when a ceiling joist fell on him. They disagreed with the doctor's analysis of his condition. His doctor privately told him that he had better scrape together the cash for the dialysis or he could expect a short and unhappy life ahead of him. The fireman had no wife and no child, which made him different from the others. He'd had elderly parents, and he'd gone into deep debt paying for their home care in the years before. Now that they were gone, all he had was his job and his health, neither of which he had any more. The insurer reported the fireman to the sheriff, as was standard procedure now when denying a claim like this one, but the sheriff had a lot to do, and not many deputies to do it with, and the deputy who was supposed to look in on the fireman had pushed it to a later date twice while he got caught up in more urgent matters. Firemen know a fair bit about explosives, as it turns out. Joe got word of the passage of Americare during a rare visit from Lacey. Leonard had advised him against pleading out, saying that the ACLU was hopeful that they could get a good precedent out of his case. But then they met with the prosecutor, who discussed in eye-watering detail what 35 years in prison does to a man. Leonard insisted that the 35-year number was total bullshit, that it would require the judge violating the United States Sentencing Commission's guidelines to such an egregious extent that the appeal would be practically automatic. But 35 years rests heavy on a man's mind. Joe imagined himself separated from Lacey and Maddie, while Maddie grew up and Lacey grew old, stepping out of the prison gates to meet a 15-year-old grandchild for the first time. Joe and Lacey cried a lot, and Maddie got scared, but in the end the prosecutor was offering 5 years, paroled in 2. He'd already been held for most of a year while the trial dragged and dragged, while other fuckriffers were arrested, while witnesses turned state's evidence. So Joe agreed to another year, maybe 4 more years, and a felony rap, and a chance to grow old with his family. The warden decided that he'd been the kind of prisoner who tolerated protective solitary well, and so that became a permanent condition, with the effect that visits were all but impossible to arrange. There was one right at the start, then 3 months, then another. They passed Americare, Lacey said. She looked terrible, exhausted, and emotionally wrung out, her rosacea hectic, the way it got when she got stressed. Joe was acutely aware of the paunch he'd watched develop around his waistline the 6 days that had passed since his weekly shower. He wanted to say something like, "It's been 3 months and all you want to talk about is Americare," but he also recognized that safe subjects were few and far between for them, and Maddie's eyes were red and big as saucers, and everyone was just doing their best. "That's good news." "It didn't have everything we wanted, but it's still pretty amazing. No one believed it would pass. No one believed the president would sign it. The lawsuit was dead on arrival, too, even though they got to choose their venue. The Federal Circuit appeals judges took about 10 seconds to tell them to go fuck themselves. No one seriously believes the Supremes will take the case, and the share prices are... I've missed you, Lacey." She stopped. Her eyes were bright with tears. "Are you okay?" He looked at Maddie. "Yes," he said. When Maddie looked away, he mouthed, "No." Lacey put her hand on the glass, and he did the same, conscious that it was such a cliché, but also feeling the psychosomatic ghost of the warmth of her skin through the thick plexiglass, like a space heater radiating directly into his own palm. Lacey was crying now. So was he. "They really passed it, huh?" he said through the snot. "Who says violence doesn't solve anything?" she said. Joe's laugh was so unexpected that he sprayed the glass with a Jackson Pollock of snot, and that set Maddie laughing, and that set Lacey laughing, a dam broken between them. Only 9 more months, assuming good behavior. And that was Radicalized by Cory Doctorow. And best better believe that one hits pretty close to home for me. And if any of you have the image or the sequence in Blade Runner 2049 where the protagonist has like a freak out where they just sort of start screaming, that's about what one feels most of the time when dealing with the insurance industry. It's so good. It's probably the most pointed of the stories in this one, and all of the stories in this one are so pointed that they hurt to touch. And this one hits very close to home. I mean, the one about the kid with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma hits particularly close to home. So the therapy described there was a bit different than the one I am familiar with. Not for me personally, but someone close to me. But it is the same general idea, so I can only assume that it is referring to the same one. Basically, what they do is they take a bunch of your blood, they fiddle with your T cells to make sure that they do the right thing, and then pump your T cells back in. It's less dire than a bone marrow transplant, thankfully. Those are, when they work, they're great, but they're no guarantee. And the treatment is often worse than what it's trying to get rid of. And you're only taking that when you have basically no other choice. The person close to me with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, those were their choices. And basically every single day afterwards, or every week, was a fight with insurance. We were fortunate in that the doctor working we were with at the time was extreme, just went up to bat constantly. She was very good. But even then, it was like very clear by the end that she was just exhausted all the time from the whole thing, but it was constant. So and there's no easy solution to the American medical care problem. There's no easy solution. There are straightforward solutions, but they involve a fairly sizable number of people miraculously discovering empathy, basically. and a lot of empathy, like empathy, debilitating empathy. And frankly, I don't think that's very likely. There is a short story by Peter Watts I'd like to read that posits that you could, in fact, enforce empathy, but it's rather extreme, and I think would generally be considered terrorism in its own right. Um, so, who says violence doesn't solve anything? I guess. So yeah, this one was a bummer, but it does even though it's a bummer, manage to have an uplifting ending. I think it is ultimately rather optimistic, uh, but at the same time very realistic in its assessment that yeah, no, if you tried to get things done, um, if you tried to take matters into your own hands, basically there'd be very little reaction beyond the public one, right up until the government branded you a terrorist, and at which point um, it's safety's off, all hands on deck, and your ass is grass. Thanks, Patriot Act. Do they call it that anymore? Do they still call the Patriot Act the Patriot Act? Let me see. The Patriot Act. Is that still kicking around? Pretty sure it is. They've got a lot of things they can do to you now as a result of that. Just about everything they can do to you now. Have they? Nope, nope, nope. Terrorism, criminal law, miscellaneous. Nope, it's still kicking around, last I could tell. This does claim that there's a bunch of sections that have expired. I think that isn't entirely true. I think some of them have been plopped into other places. Like, for instance, authority to intercept wire, oral, and electronic communications relating to terrorism and others. This claims that, well, there's a line through that. Oh, no, these are all still in effect. Yep, 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 yep. I know how to read charts. Yep. So, yeah, basically, the government can do whatever it wants. It's the practical upshot. You can make it, you can slow that down, but man, there's a lot. There's a lot. This we're doing right now, provided they have the manpower. Whoo boy. Oh yeah, red flag laws, Jesus. And those can't be abused. Whoo dog. Um, and yellow flag laws and yeah. And of course, like if they were being used in some productive way to keep people from shooting up schools, for instance, it'd be one thing. But there's a much simpler solution to that particular problem, and I think we all know what it is. That's any kind of gun control. Any at all. I'll take baby steps at this point, for Christ's sake. It's just. Uh, anyway, that's a subject I can get worked up about. And I don't even have a dog in that race, per se. It's just like, there's nothing okay about that situation, and it's got a very straightforward solution, but it requires, again, some people develop like crippling amounts of empathy for other human beings and human suffering, and we just don't have that right now. That would help. I think people could be incentivized. Clearly, the fear of kindergartens getting shot up isn't enough. I think we all thought it was, and then and then clearly it wasn't. I mean, they do that already, and it's not helping. I mean, you've got a situation now where uh, people are actually suggesting to teachers that they should have guns, and that's not solving the problem. It's not. It's like, oh, here, let's solve the problem by throwing more guns out there. Let's make teachers learn how to shoot guns. No, no. I'm not going to go so far as to say make having a gun, owning a gun, illegal, because people will get violently up in arms, haha, about that one. But it's like, anyway. Anyway, so this short story is a lot of fun. I really like the description of the is it a hospital or an insurance building? Um, that's got like set up like a friggin' fortress. Oh, here's a bunch of guard towers. Here's a bunch of license plate scanners and all that, as well as the so doing anything at all to keep from actually addressing the problem. And then of course the he's been captured. He's locked into he's handcuffed in a hospital bed, and the hospital and his insurance company isn't covering it, so the hospital wants his money. So it's like, oh, okay. It's like, oh yeah, that's delightful. That would do it. That would do it. That would definitely convince one, I think, to be like, nah, nah, nah. There's a principle at stake here. I'm sorry. Anyway, good times. So this is probably the most pointed I am likely to read recently. I'm going to try and go a break because I think sometimes this stuff can get one rather stressed. Um, Next week, we will be doing Mask of the Red Death, which is also pointed, but at least has a whole lot of weaponized schadenfreude, which is a good time for anyone who delights in the suffering of people who really fucking deserve it.
Things are gonna get so much better. Let's push those negative energies into something productive, like a mind knife.
Anyway, I had some other salient harping point, but I can't remember what it was. So yeah, we'll be doing this again next week with Mask of the Red Death, which will be the last short story in the Radicalized short story collection. After that, I will figure out what I'm doing for Wednesdays. I don't know. Um, the possibilities are endless. Probably the Maria Davana Headley Beowulf translation. It's fairly short and sweet. Also, possibly Termouche by Nordic guy whose name I can't remember right now because my brain isn't good. Sorry, getting old sucks. I do other streams throughout the week. If you're just tuning into this now, I do these live in front of a live studio audience of whoever happens to tune in at the time. I start streaming at about noon Eastern Standard Time or daily time or what US East Coast time, whatever time bracket that is. Um, about noon. Usually I'm a couple minutes late. I stream on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Usually every month I update playlists. Thank you, by the way, to whoever left a comment. I can't remember your name. I'm about to look it up. Thank you, Josh Kerr, for telling me that one of my playlists for Luminous is fucked up. I will unbugger that. I'll sort it out. Yeah. So with that. Excuse me. Oh, why is that showing the wrong one on Wordy Wednesdays? Oh, right, because I did Hyperion stuff for the first couple of the Wordy Wednesdays. Never mind. Thanks, YouTube. In other news, I have not gotten another, whatchamacallit, copyright strike, so things are good for the next 90 days.
Sorry, 84 days. Unless, of course, the company in question that got decided to get the word out, in which case I could be in a lot of trouble.
Fortunately, I do back these up. I promise, hopefully by the end of the month, I will have a Discord channel or something up and running so that people can actually communicate with me. And more to the point, I can actually get these to people. Because that would help. So basically, I'll have it so that anybody can ask, can you hook me up with files of your reading of what have you, and I will get it to them. They are again unedited, which is of questionable value, but they'll be there. The audio will be in there. You'll have to fiddle around with them, maybe do the editing yourself. I don't know. I'm lazy. Anyway, at any rate, that's basically where we're at. And on Mondays, I'm doing Mecha Mondays, where I'm reading. Right now, we're reading through. You know what? Bugger that. If you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. We'll get it another week. Right now, my brain's just scrambled. I don't know if I have a cold or if it's just the weather changing over, but my head's in the wrong spot right now. Also, reading that short story really messes with me. It's very good, but it's like that throws me off my equilibrium. At any rate, stay safe as best you all can. Stay sane as best you all can. Goodness knows that's getting harder to do. And be decent to each other as best you all can. Don't let the horrors of modern life get you down. As best you all can. Have we said that? Yes, we have. In any case, thanks again to everyone. Have a good one. That's it. I know this was a short one because I had to cut the other one in half due to me being a dork and having bad scheduling. So we had to cut it in half. Hopefully we won't have to do the same thing next week. We will find out. Then that one's about the same length. It's like, I don't know, 60 pages. Yeah, it's about 60 pages. Yeah, about 60 pages. So I might have to cut that one in half. Otherwise, it'll just be long. It'll probably go out to like 3 p.m. or so, 3:30. Anyway, thanks again. And yeah, yep. Uplifting Platitude number 572.